The United Idolaters by Rudyard Kipling. His name was Brownell, and his reign was brief. He came from the Central Anglican Scholastic Agency, a soured, clever, reddish man picked up by the head at the very last moment of the summer holidays, in default of Macrea's house, who wired from Switzerland that he had smashed a knee mountaineering and would not be available that term. Looking back at the affair, one sees that the head should have warned Mr. Brownell of the college's outstanding peculiarity, instead of leaving him to discover it for himself the first day of the term, when he went for a walk to the beach and saw Potiphar Mullen's head of games smoking without conceal on the sands, part having the whole of the autumn football, challenges, acceptances, and 15 reconstructions to work out, did not at first comprehend Mr. Brownell's shrill cry of "You're smoking, sir," but he removed his pipe and answered placably enough, "The army class is allowed to smoke, sir." Mr. Brownell replied, "Preposterous." Part, seeing that this new person was uninformed, suggested that he should refer to the head. "You may be sure I shall, sir, then we shall see." Mr. Brownell and his umbrella scudded off, and Part returned to his match plannings. Anon he observed, much as the Almighty might observe black beetles, 2 small figures coming over the pebble ridge, a few hundred PG 71 yards to his right. They were a major and his minor, the latter, new boy, and as such entitled to his brother's countenance, for exactly 3 days after, which he would fend for himself. Part waited till they were well out on the great stretch of Mother-o'-Pearl sands, then caused his groundash to describe a magnificent whirl of command in the air. "Come on," said the major. "Run." "What for?" said the minor, who had noticed nothing. "'Cause we're wanted, leg it." "Oh, I can do that," the minor replied, and at the end of the sprint fetched up a couple of yards ahead of his brother, and much less winded. "You're minor," said Part, looking over them seawards. "Yes, Mullins," the major replied. "All right, cut along." They cut on the word. "High flood, major, come back." Back fled the elder. "Your wind's bad, too fat, you grunt like a pig." "Mustn't do it, understand, go away." "What was all that for?" the minor asked on the major's return. "To see if we could run, you fool." "Well, I ran faster than you anyhow," was the scandalous retort. "Look here, minor, if you go on talking like this, you'll get yourself kicked all round coal, and you mustn't stand like you did when a prefect's talking to you." The minor's eyes opened with awe. "I thought it was only one of the masters," said he. "Masters, it was Mullins, head o' games. You are a putrid young ass." By what seemed pure chance, Mr. Brownell ran into PG 72, the school chaplain, the Reverend John Gillette, beating up against the soft September rain that no native ever troubled to wear a coat for. "I was trying to catch you after lunch," the latter began. "I wanted to show you our objects of local interest." "Thank you, I've seen all I want," Mr. Brownell answered. "Gillette, is there anything about me which suggests the congenital dupe?" "It's early to say yet," the chaplain answered. "Who've you been meeting?" "A youth called Mullins, I believe," and indeed there was Potiphar groundash pipe, and all quarterdecking serenely below the pebble ridge. "Oh, I see old Potter ahead of games. He's smoking now before those 2 little boys, too." Mr. Brownell panted. "He had the audacity to tell me that." "Yes, the Reverend John Cut in the army class is allowed to smoke, not in their studies, of course, but within limits out of doors. You see, we have to compete against the crammers' establishments where smoking's usual." This was true of the only school in England. Was this the cold truth, and for the reason given in that unprogressive age? "Good heavens," said Mr. Brownell, "to the gulls and the grey sea, and I was never warned." "The head is a little forgetful, I ought to have, but it's all right," the chaplain added soothingly. "Part want to give you away." Mr. Brownell, who knew what smoking led to, testified out of his 12 years' experience of what he called the animal boy. He left little unexplored or unexplained. PG 73. "There may be something in what you say," the Reverend John assented, "but as a matter of fact their actual smoking doesn't amount to much. They talk a great deal about their brands of tobacco practically. It makes them rather keen on putting down smoking among the juniorses, an encroachment on their privilege. You see, they lick 'em twice as hard for it as we'd dare to." "Lick!" Mr. Brownell cried. One expels. I know the end of these practices." He told his companion in detail, with anecdotes and inferences, a great deal more about the animal boy. "Ah," said the Reverend John to himself, "you'll leave at the end of the term. But y'all have a deuce of a time first aloud. Well, I suppose no one can be sure of any school's tendency at any given moment. But personally, I should incline to believe that we're reasonably free from theomonastic microbes older institutions. But a school's a school, you can't get out of that. It's preposterous, you must admit, that Mr. Brownell insisted. They were within hail of part by now, and the Reverend John asked him how affairs of state stood. All right, thank you, sir. How are you, sir? Loungin' round and sufferin', my son. What about the dates of the Exeter and Tiverton matches? As late in the term as we can get 'em, don't you think, sir? Quite specially Blundell's, they're our dearest foe, he explained to the frozen Mr. Brownell Arrant. We rather light in the scrum just now, Mullins. 'Fraid so, sir, but Packman's playin' forward this term. At last cried the Reverend John. Packman was PG 74 Part second in command, who considered himself a heaven-born halfback, but Part had been working on him diplomatically. Hell be a pillar, at any rate lend me one of your fusees, please, I've only got matches. Mr. Brownell was unused to this sort of talk. A bad beginning to a bad business, he muttered, as they returned to college. Part finished out his meditations from time to time, rubbing up the gloss on his new 7 sixpenny, silver-mounted rather hot milewood pipe, with its very thin crust in the bowl. As the studies brought back brackets and pictures for their walls, so did they bring odds and ends of speech theatre opera, and music-hall gags from the great holiday world, some of which stuck for a term, and others were discarded. Number 5 was unpacking, when Dick Four King's House of the Red Nose, and Dramatic Instincts, who with Pussy and Tertius one inhabited the study below, loafed up, and asked them how their symptoms seemed to segregate. They said nothing at the time, for they knew Dick had a giddy uncle who took him to the pavilion, and the cry, and all would be explained later. But before they met again, Beetle came across 2 fags at war in a box-room, one of whom cried to the other, "Turn me loose, or ill knock the natal stuffin' out of you." Beetle demanded why he, being awful, presumed to use this strain speech. The fag said it came out of a new book about rabbits and foxes and turtles and niggers, which was in his locker. Uncle Remus was a popular holiday gift book in Shotover's year. When Setwio lived in the Melbury Road, Arabi Pasha in Egypt, and Sparforth on the Oval. Beetle had PG 75 it out, and read for some time, standing by the window ere he carried it off to number 5, and began at once to give a wonderful story of a tar baby. Stocky tore it from him, because he sputtered incoherently. McTurk, for the same cause, wrenching it from Stocky. There was no prep that night. The book was amazing, and full of quotations that one could hurl like javelins when they came down to prayers. Stocky, to show he was abreast of the latest movement, pounded on the door of Dick Four's study, shouting a couplet that pleased him. Upon which Dick Four, hornpiping and squinting, and not at all unlike a bullfrog, came out and answered from the bottom of his belly, whence he could produce incredible noises. The chants seemed to answer the ends of their being created for the moment. They all sang them the whole way up the corridor, and after prayers bore the burdens dispersedly to their several dormitories, where they found many who knew the book of the words, but who boylike had waited for a lead air-giving tongue. In a short time the college was as severely infected with Uncle Remus as it had been with Pinafore and Patience. King realized it specially because he was running Macrea's house in addition to his own, and Dick Four said was telling his new charges what he thought of his esteemed colleague's methods of house control. PG 76. The Reverend John was talking to the head in the latter's study, perhaps a fortnight later. "If you'd only wired me," he said, "I could have dug up something that might have tided us over. This man's dangerous." "Me culpa," the head replied. "I had so much on hand, our governing council alone, but what do we make of him? Trust youth, we call him Mr. Brownell. Just Mr. It took us 3 days to plumb his soul. And he doesn't approve of our institutions. You say he is on the track, eh? He suspects the worst." The school chaplain nodded. "Well, I should say that was the one tendency we had not developed. Setting aside, we haven't even a curtain in a dormitory, let alone a lock to any form room door. There has to be tradition in these things. So I believe so indeed. One knows antisn't, as if I ever preached on personal purity either." The head laughed. "No, or you'd join Brownell at term end. By the way, what's this new line of patristic discourse you're giving us in church? I found myself listening to some of it last Sunday." "Oh, my early Christianity sermons. I bought a dozen ready-made in town, just before I came down. Someone who knows his Gibbon must have done 'em. Aren't they good?" The Reverend John, who was no hand at written work, beamed self-approvingly. There was a knock and Pot entered. The weather had defeated him at last. All footer grounds, he reported, were unplayable, and must be rested. His idea to keep things going was big, and PG-77 little side paper chases thrice a week for the juniors, a shortish course on the burrows which he intended to oversee personally the first few times, while packmen lunged big side across the inland and upland ploughs for proper sweats. There was some question of bounds that he asked authority to vary, and would the head please say which afternoons would interfere least with the army class extra tuition. As to bounds, the head left those as usual entirely to Pot. The Reverend John volunteered to shift one of his extra 2 classes from 4 to 5 p. Roman 1000, till after prayers 9 to 10, the whole question was settled in 5 minutes. We hate paper chases, don't we, Pot? The headmaster asked as the head of games rose. Yes, sir, but it keeps em in training. Good night, sir. To go back, drawled the head, when the door was well shut. No, I do not think so. Ye's hell leave at the end of the term. How does it go? Don't spute wid de squinch owl jammed a shovel in de fear. Have you come across that extraordinary book, by the way? Oh yes, we've got it badly too. It has some sort of elemental appeal, I suppose. Here Mr. King came in with a neat little scheme for the reorganization of certain details in Macrea's house, where he had detected reprehensible laxities. The head sighed. The Reverend John only heard the beginnings of it, then he slid out softly. He remembered. He had not written to Macrea for quite a long time. The first big side paper chase in blinding wet was as vile as even the groaning and bemired beetle had prophesied. But Dick Four had managed to run his own PG-78 line when it skirted Bideford, and turned up at the lavatories half an hour late, cherishing a movable tumour beneath his sweater. In Glegajeng he chanted, and slipped out a warm but coy land tortoise. My sacred hat, cried Stalky Brer Terrapin. Were you catchy what you makido avik? This was Stalky's notion of how they talked in Uncle Remus, and he spake no other tongue for weeks. I don't know yet, but I had to get him man with a barrow full of in Bridge Street. Gave me my choice for a bob. Leave him alone, you owl, he won't swim where you've been washing your filthy self. I am right at home, my joy, my joy. Dick's nose shone like Bardolph's as he bubbled in the bath. Just before tea time he, Pussy and Tertius broke in upon number 5, processionally singing. Brer Terrapin, painted or and sable King's housecolor swung by a neatly contrived belly band from the end of a broken jumping pole. They thought rather well of taking him in to tea. They called at 1 or 2 studies on the way, and were warmly welcomed, but when they reached the still shut doors of the Dinninghole, Richard's ex-petty officer R.N. was always unpunctual, but they needn't have called him Stinking Jim. The whole school shouted approval. After the meal Brer Terrapin was borne the round of the form rooms, from number 1 to number 12, in an unbroken roar of homage. PG-79. Tomorrow Dick Four announced well sacrificed to him fags in blazin paper baskets, and with thundering Inglegajengs, the idol retired to its shrine. It had been a satisfactory performance. Little Hartup surprised labelling rocks in number 12, which held the Natural History Museum, had laughed consumedly, and the Reverend John just before prep complimented Dick that he had not a single dissenter to his following in this respect. The affair was an advance on Byzantium and Alexandria, which of course were torn by rival sects led by militant bishops or zealous heathen vidi beetle Hypatia, and if Dick Four ever listened, instead of privily swatting up his Euclid in church, the Reverend John's own sermons, Mr. King, who had heard the noise but had not appeared, made no comment till dinner, when he told the common room ceiling that he entertained the lowest opinion of Uncle Remus' buffoonery, but opined that it might interest certain types of intellect. Little Hartup, school librarian, who had by special request laid in an extra copy of the book, differed acridly. He had, he said, heard or overheard every salient line of Uncle Remus, quoted appositely too by boys whom he would not have credited with intellectual interests. Mr. King repeated that he was wearied by the senseless and childish repetitions of immature minds. He recalled the patient's epidemic. Mr. Prout did not care for Uncle Remus. The dialect put him off, but he thought the houses were getting a bit out of hand. There was nothing one could lay hold of course as. Yet Mr. Brownell interjected darkly, but this larking about in form rooms, he added, had potentialities which, if he knew anything of the animal boy would developer, had developed. I shouldn't wonder, said the Reverend John, this PG-80 is the first time to my knowledge that Stalky has ever played second fiddle to anyone. Brer Terrapin was entirely Dick Four's notion. By the way he was painted your house colours, King. Was he, said King artlessly. I have always held that our Dixon Quartus had the rudiments of imagination. We will look into it. In our loathsome calling more things are done by judicious letting alone than by any other, the Reverend John grunted. I can't subscribe to that, said Mr. Prout. You haven't a house, and for once Mr. King backed Prout. Thank heaven I haven't, or I should be like you too. Leave em alone. Leave em alone. Haven't you ever seen puppies fighting over a slipper for hours? Yes, but Gillette admits that Dixon Quartus was the only begetter of this manifestation. I wasn't aware that theatestation had been tricked out in my colours, said King. And at that very hour No. 5 Studderprep, thrown to the windswer, toiling inspiredly at a tar baby, made up of Beetle's sweater and half a dozen lavatory towels, a condemned cretonne curtain and ditto baize tablecloth for natal stuffin', an ancient but airtight puntabout ball for the head, all 3 playbox ropes for bindings, and most of Richard's weekly blacking allowance for Prout's house's boots to give tone to the gummy, said Beetle when their curtain pole had been taken down, and tar baby hitched to the end of it by a loop in its voluptuous back. It looks pretty average indecent somehow. You can use it this way too, Turkey demonstrated PG-81, handling the curtain pole like a flail. Now shove it in the fireplace to dry and well wash up. But, said Storky, fascinated by the unspeakable front and behind of the black and bulging horror. How come he looky so hellish? Dead easy if you do anything with your whole heart. Ruskin says you always pull off something damn fine. Brer Terrapin's only a natural animal, but tar baby's art, McTurk explained. I see if you're anxious for to shine in the high aesthetic line. Well, tar baby's the filthiest thing I've ever seen in my life, Storky, concluded Kingleby Rabbit. The United Idolaters set forth side by side at 5 o'clock next afternoon, Brer Terrapin wide awake and swimming hard into nothing, tar baby lurching from side to side, with a lascivious abandon that made Foxy the school sergeant taking defaulters drill in the corridor squawk like an outraged hen, and when they ceremoniously saluted each other like aristocratic heads on revolutionary pikes, it beat the previous day's performance out of sight, and mined the very fags offered up, till the bottoms of the paper baskets carried away, as heavy offerings before them fell over each other for the honour, and house by house, when the news spread, dropped its doings, and followed the mysterious not without song. Some say it was a fag of Prout's who appealed for rescue from Brer Terrapin to tar baby. Others, that the introits to the respective creeds in Glegajang T, tungally carried in themselves the seeds of dissent. At any rate, the cleavage developed as swiftly as in a new religion, and by tea-time, when they were PG-82 fairly hoarse, the rolling world was rent to the death between Ingalls versus Tungles, and Brer Terrapin had swept out No. 11 form room to the walkery Here I Come a Bulgin, and Abilene Prep stopped further developments, but they agreed that as a recreation for wet autumn evenings, the jape was unequalled, and called for its repetition on Sat. That was a brilliant evening too. Both sides went into prayers, practically redressing themselves. There was a smell of singed fag down the lines, and a watery eye or so, but nothing to which the most fastidious could have objected. The Reverend John hinted something about roof-lifting noises. Oh no, Padre Sahib, we were only billin' and cooin', a bit stocky explained. We haven't really begun. There's goin' to be a two-gore next Saturday with Miss Meadows' bedcord, which in dem days would ha hilt a mule. The Reverend John quoted. Well, I've got to be impartial. I wish you both good luck. The week with its 3 paper chases passed uneventfully, but for a certain amount of raiding and reprisals on new lines that might have warned them they were playing with fire, the juniors had learned to use the sacred warchants as signals of distress, oppressed Ingalls squealing for aid against oppressing Tungles and vice versa, so that one never knew when a peaceful formroom would flare up in song and slaughter, but not a soul dreamed for a moment that that Saturday's jape would develop. In Tohat it did. They were rigidly punctilious about the ritual, exquisitely careful as to the weights on Miss Meadows' bedcord, kindly lent by Richards, who said he knew nothing about mules, but guaranteed it would hold a barge's crew. And if Dick PG-8034 chose to caparison himself as Archimandrite of Joppa Black as burned cork, could make him Wystocki in a nightgown kilted up beneath his sweater, was equally the Pope Symmachus, just converted from heathendom, but given to alarming relapses. It began after Tissay 6p Roman 1000. It got into its stride by 7, when Turkey, with pillows bound round the ends of forms, invented the royal battering-ram corps. It grew and it grew, till 8:45, when the prefects, most of whom had fought on one side or the other, thought it time to stop, and went in with ground ashes and the bare hand for 10 minutes. Honours for the action were not awarded by the head, till Monday morning, when he dealt out 12 lickings to selected seniors, 8 millis 1014 usuals, 500 lines minor impositions past count, and a stoppage of pocket money on a scale, and for a length of time unprecedented in modern history. He said the college was within an ace of being burned to the ground, when the gas jet in number 11 form room where they tried to burn tar baby fallen for the moment into the hands of the enemy was wrenched off, and the lit gas spouted all over the ceiling till someone plugged the pipe with dormitory soap. He said that nothing save his consideration for their future careers kept him from expelling the wanton ruffians who had noosed all the desks in number 12, and swept them up in one crackling mound, barring a couple that had pitch-poled through the window. This again had been no man's design, but the inspiration of necessity when tar baby's bodyguard surrounded, but Defiant was only rescued at the last minute by Turkey's immortal flank attack, with the battering rams that carried away the PG-84 door of number 9. He said that the same remarks applied to the fireplace and mantelpiece in number 7, which everybody had seen fall out of the wall of their own motion, after Brer Terrapin had hitched Miss Meadows' bedcord to the bars of the grate. He said much more too, but as King pointed out in common room that evening, his canings were inept, he had not confiscated the idols, and above all had not castigated as King would have castigated the disgusting childishness of all concerned. Well said Little Hartop, I saw the prefects choking them off as we came into prayers. You've reason to reckon that, in the scale of suffering, and more than half the damage was done under your banner, King. The Reverend John added, that doesn't affect my judgment, though as a matter of fact I believe Brer Terrapin triumphed over tar baby all along the line, didn't he, Prout? It didn't seem to me a fitting time to ask. The tar babies were handicapped, of course, by not being able to tackle a live animal. I confess Mr. Brownell volunteered it was the studious perversity of certain aspects of the orgy which impressed me, and yet what can one How do you mean? King demanded. Dixon Quartus may be eccentric, but I was alluding to the vile and calculated indecency of that black dog. Mr. Brownell had passed tar baby, going down to battle all round and ripe, before Turkey had begun to use it, as Bishop Odo's Hollywater sprinkler. It is possible you didn't. I never noticed anything, said Prout. If there had been, I should have been the first. PG-85. Here Little Hartop sniggered, which did not cool the air. Peradventure, King began with due intake of the breath. Peradventure, even I might have taken cognizance of the matter both for my own house's sake, and for my colleagues. No folly, I concede. Utter childishness and complete absence of discipline in all quarters as the natural corollary to dabbling in so-called transatlantic humor, I frankly admit, but that there was anything esoterically obscene in the outbreak, I absolutely deny. They've been fighting for weeks over those things, said Mr. Prout. Silly, of course, but I don't see how it can be dangerous. Quite true, any housemaster of experience knows that. Brownell. The Reverend John put in reprovingly. Given a normal basis of tradition, and conduct certainly, Mr. Brownell answered, but with such amazing traditions as exist here no man with any experience of the animal boy can draw your deceptive inferences. That's all I meaned. Once again, and not for the first time, but with greater heat, he testified what smoking lead tohat, indeed he was morally certain, existed in full blast under their noses. Gloves were off in 3 minutes. Pessimists no more than poets love each other, and even when they work together it is one thing to pessimize congenially with an ancient and tried associate, who is also a butt, and another to be pessimized over by an inexperienced junior, even though the latter's college career may have included more exhibitions. Nay, even Pothentinks than one's own. The Reverend John did his best to pour water on the flames. Little Hartop, perceiving that it was pure PG-86 oil, threw in canfuls of his own from the wings in the end words past, which would have made the common room uninhabitable for the future. But that Macria had written. The Reverend John had seen the letter saying that his knee was fairly reknit, and he was prepared to take on again at half-term. This happened to be the only date since the creation beyond which Mr. Brownell's self-respect would not permit him to stay 1 hour. It solved the situation amid puffings and blowings and bitter epigrams, and a most distinguished stateliness of bearing all round, till Mr. Brownell's departure. My dear fellow, said the Reverend John to Macria on the first night of the latter's return, I do hope there was nothing in my letters to you asked me to keep you posted that gave you any idea King wasn't doing his best with your house, according to his lights. Not in the least, said Macria. I've the greatest respect for King, But after all, one's house is one's house, one can't stand it being tinkered with by well-meaning outsiders. To Mr. Brownell on Bideford station platform, the Reverend John's last words were, "Well, well, you mustn't judge us too harshly, I dare say. There's a great deal in what you say, oh yes." King's conduct was inexcusable, absolutely inexcusable. About the smoking, lamentable, but we must all bow down more or less in the House of Rimmon. We have to compete with the crammers' shops. To the head, in the silence of his study next day, he didn't seem to me the kind of animal who'd keep to advantage in our atmosphere. Luckily, he lost his temper, King, and he our own brothers, and he couldn't withdraw his resignation. Pg 87. Excellent. After all, it's only a few pounds to make up ill, slip it in under our recenter barrack damages. And what do we think of it all, Gillette? We do not think it Alany of us, said the Reverend John. Youth is its own prophylactic, thank heaven. And the head, not usually devout, echoed, thank heaven. It was worth it, Dick 4 pronounced on review of the profit-and-loss account, with number 5 in his study. Heaplenty Bangasses Stocky assented. But why didn't King roar up and cuss tar? Baby Beetle asked. You perfect fatended fool, Stocky began. Keep your hair on. We all know the Idolaters wasn't our Uncle Stocky's idea, but why didn't King? Because Dick took care to paint Brer Terrapin King's house colours. You can always conciliate King by soothin' his putrid esprit de maison, ain't that true, Dick? Dick 4, with the smile of modest worth unmasked, said it was so. And now Turkey yawned King and Mackerel jaw for the rest of the term, how he ran his house, when Macria was trying to marry fat widows in Switzerland. Mountaineerin' bet Macria never went near a mountain. One good job, though I go back to Macria, for maths he does know something, said Stocky. Why didn't Mr. know anything? Beetle asked. Pg 88. Bout as much as you was, Stocky's reply. I don't go about pretending to. What was he like? Mr. O, rather like King and water. Only water was not precisely the fluid that Stocky thought fit to mention. Pg 89.